Joining us today. Excited to help get everybody up and running with Fugue. It should be a really quick process. So really quick, at Fugue, we recognize that software developers own the security of their cloud infrastructure and wanted to build tools they can use to keep that infrastructure secure and move fast. And what Fugue does essentially is it surveys your cloud environment, gets information back from your cloud service provider, AWS in today's instance, about all the resources you have running and all the configuration attributes of those resources. What we can do then is present to you an infrastructure visualization of your environment that can surface a number of issues you might need to address immediately. Identify policy violations, misconfiguration risks, and give you some valuable, enriched feedback on what you need to do to bring those into compliance. And you know, developers can use Fugue API to scan their cloud dev environments to get that information on where they're violating policy early, so they can fix that and move fast and avoid those headaches later. Fugue can be integrated into CI/CD to survey and validate staging environments before deploying to production. And once you're in production, Fugue can keep an eye on everything, identify change as it occurs, and alert you on that. And for those security critical resources, you can automatically remediate drift, unwanted drift, the moment it happens without having to run any scripts or bots that hit lambdas, those kinds of things. So hopefully, not only is Fugue really helpful for you to be more productive and secure, but that it's fun to use. And I think we'll see a little bit of that today. So I'm going to throw it over to our senior solutions architect, Ricardo Green, who's going to walk through getting up and running with Fugue. Take it away, Ricardo.
Thank you, Drew. So thank you all for spending some time with us today. This portion should only take us about 30 minutes, maybe 40 minutes max, and we'll definitely have some pauses in there and leave some opportunity to ask questions, or time permitting, if there are other use cases that you want to see during this setup portion, I can actually show those to you live. But for now, we'll jump right in. Really, the goal of this for this session is really to get you up and going. So as an agenda, we're going to define our first Fugue environment. I'm going to give you a pretty deep overview of the Fugue dashboard. So you will be able to administer the accounts, add additional users, select groups to restrict certain accesses. And as we define that environment, we're also going to generate the infrastructure visualization. So everybody will get to see a diagram of the account that they've pointed Fugue at and see the visualization view, and I'll go over that in detail. We'll also take a look at our environment that we created against CIS benchmarks, and we'll also add the Fugue best practices in there as well. And then I will show you how to detect and understand the changes made to your cloud environment. So we're going to do that by establishing a baseline and then show you an example of what some of those changes might be. So with that, we're going to get going. So first thing I want to do is I'm hoping that everyone has had the opportunity to register for their account. So what you're seeing now is if you go to fugue.co/go, that's where you would register for an account. If you have not done that, then I would say just take notes. Registering is pretty simple. You complete this form, you get an email confirmation, and then you're able to be off and running once you do that. So I'm hoping you've done that prior. If not, if you want to take a couple of minutes to do that while I'm talking, I will slow down. If you wanted to raise your hand or post in the chat that you haven't registered, do that. Somebody on the panel can alert me, Sivy or Drew can let me know, and we could slow down a bit. But we want to make sure you've gotten this portion taken care of, and then we can go ahead and get started. So once you have logged in, you get brought to a registration page. not a registration, the page to actually define your first environment. So that's what we're going to do. Before we do that, I want to just take a quick look at the account setup. So everybody that establishes their Fugue account, you will have an account screen which will give you details. Everybody that signs up for the developer version, during the first 30 days, you actually have an enterprise trial. So the enterprise trial gives you all of the features, all of the compliance libraries that Fugue scans for. The primary feature that you won't get out of the box is the single sign-on. So setting up SSO is not something that you'll do during the trial period. Once you become a Fugue customer and have the enterprise edition, that's when you'll get that. But you have an unlimited number of environments that you can create. You can also add a number of different users and groups and have all of the compliance families and role-based access controls available to you. So with that, we are going to define our first environment. So I'm going to do this live. Hopefully you all are on this screen as well, having logged in, and we can go ahead with the process of defining our first environment. First thing we're going to do is give the environment a name, and we're going to select AWS. As you can see, Azure is also an option. We will be doing a webinar on Tuesday of next week, getting set up with Azure. We also have a lot of that detailed information in our docs, but we'll be going through that same process. So as you can see, Fugue is a multi-cloud tool. So once we select our provider, we give our environment a name, we are going to select an AWS region. So I'm actually going to select US West 2 because I know I've got some demo environment set up there. As you can see here, we also are going to select the resource types. For the sake of this webinar, I'm actually going to choose all of the resource types. Fugue is extremely deep in terms of the configuration aspect, the things that we capture in understanding your environment to enable us to not only check compliance, but to be able to draw out the network diagram to give you that information. So you will see a number of different services that we are contacting within AWS, within your AWS account, which will enable us to get that configuration information and also manage that. So we're just going to select all. Other things to note here is we use a security audit managed read-only policy, which is an AWS best practice, but it allows us to just perform gets, describes, and lists on a number of these resources. If we go and decide that we want to do enforcement, as Drew had mentioned, we actually handle auto remediation. You will have to change some of these. You will have to increase some of the inline policies to permit enforcement, which is some read-write permissions. For the sake of this demonstration, we're just going to scan everything. And we are going to launch a stack. So this will, if you are logged into your AWS account, this will automatically redirect into that AWS account. So we can launch that stack. It's a CloudFormation stack that will deploy the IAM role that we will need in order to access the information within the account to start working with Fugue. So we've already done the hard part. So the CloudFormation stack is already pre-generated based on the selection of the resource types that we made there. So we're just gonna go through this process and click next. So we start that process there. We're actually going to wait for the output. So if anybody has questions while we're waiting on the output results to get the role on, please post those in the chat or raise your hand and somebody can answer the questions for you. So there we have it. That's our role ARN that we just created. So we're going to copy that, go back into our Fugue console and paste that in. We hit continue. So for the sake of this, and you can certainly select something different, but for the sake of this, we're just going to select CIS benchmarks and Fugue best practices. As you can see with Fugue, we have a number of compliance libraries. One of the differences that you will find with Fugue and other tools is that we're very deep in terms of how we have laid out the information that you're going to get back. So with these specific compliance families, you will get direct controls that will relate to the compliance families. So you'll see that in terms of CIS. So CIS 1-1 through 9 or however many, and we'll see the details of that. With HIPAA, NIST, and others, you will see direct relationships between what's in the compliance families, what's actually listed out, and the direct controls and mapping within AWS. So we're very deep in that regard. Your auditors, security analysts, and others will really appreciate the information that they get back. So this is just our confirmation screen. So we're going to look at everything here from our environment name, the proper cloud service provider. We've got our role ARN, and we've selected our 2 compliance families. We can also make sure that we are scanning all the resource types that Fugue offers. And we're good there. And we are going to approve and begin our initial scan. So I'm going to pause there to see if there are any questions. Sivya, if there's any hands raised or questions, we can go through those. If not, I will proceed.
I am not seeing any questions coming up. Please do not hesitate to ask. It's a great time.
One of the things that we often say when we work with customers is that getting connected and up and running with Fugue literally takes 10 to 15 minutes. So one of the reasons we did this webinar is really to prove that. We do these live with customers. We offer any customer that wants to sign up to have the ability to, at a minimum, do a scan, get a network visualization. So really interact with Fugue to make sure that you're getting that actionable information on your first interaction with Fugue. So that's really one of the goals that we set out to do. Now, while we're doing that scan, what I'm going to do is go through some of the organizational or administrative aspects of the Fugue dashboard while that scan is going on. So what we have here is this is where you would add additional users. So, and even before you add users, you could potentially add groups. So groups that you're going to restrict access to. So let's just say you have an analyst group, and we're going to give them read-only access to our webinar demo. So we create that group. So whenever we create an additional user, and I'll just send this to myself. And add in the analyst group. So at this point, when I get this email, I'm not going to send it, but I would be able to log in to Fugue. I'd be able to register myself and log in. Now I would have only read-only access. So I would be able to get the information regarding compliance, but some of the other activities, environment creation, and other things I would not be able to do. And you have access to that by way of if you have registered and signed up with your enterprise trial. The other thing I will point out is API clients. So everything that I'm going to show you today in regards to the Fugue dashboard, all of that information is available to you via the API. So I think Drew mentioned it in the intro. When you start automating certain tasks, when you want to trigger scans in an on-demand fashion, whenever you deploy new infrastructure and you want to trigger a scan, this is something that you can automate by adding an API client. There's a client ID and client secret that you would grab. Additionally, we have a lot of detail in our documentation, as well as what I'm showing on screen is the Swagger UI. So you could actually interact with our API without going into your own CLI or writing a script. You could do it directly here, or we use Postman if you're familiar with Postman as a tool to test and interact with APIs. You could do that as well. Here, you would just authorize it by adding your client ID and client secret, and you'd be able to actually perform a lot of those functions here directly in a UI, which is nice. Alternatively, you could work within our documentation. You would see that the Fugue docs, we actually start you here with getting started. And a lot of the steps that you'll see are a lot of the steps that we're going to go over right now. But you could do that on your own within the documentation, which is great. Additionally, if you had or wanted to inquire more about our API, you can simply do a search, which will direct you to the API user guide. And you'd be able to get details about the Fugue API, all of the Fugue API endpoints, use cases, and additional commands that you may want to run. So notifications. From a notification perspective, you have a couple of different options. If we create a notification, we can subscribe to an SNS topic, and then all the notifications would go to SNS. You would subscribe to the topic, and it could be sent to additional tools. You could also just create a notification and have it sent to an email. So a number of different options of how you would interact from a notifications perspective. But notifications you would be collecting whenever there are any events that happen that change in compliance, any configuration drift events. So anytime somebody changes the configuration that you have set, you would get a notification, and also auto remediation. So we'll talk a little bit more about baseline and baseline enforcement, but you would get a notification as well whenever Fugue made an auto remediation on your behalf based on a deviation from the baseline. And the last thing we'll touch on here is custom rules. Custom rules allow you to essentially create your own compliance families or compliance rules that may not be specific to a compliance family, but maybe a security policy. So we use OPA, which is Open Policy Agent. The underlying language is Rego, which will allow you to actually write custom rules specific to corporate policies. So they could be based on instance sizes that you may have. They could be based on certain AWS AMIs that you only want to see deployed as EC2 instances in your environment. Really a number of different things, rules that you may have. It could even be tagging. So you can get very granular with the rules. More detail about writing custom rules could be found here in the Open Policy Agent link there. And it gives you additional details in terms of writing Rego policies, which are fairly simple to write if you have a familiarity with programming languages. We've done a lot of the abstraction, so you can actually select the rules based on a specific resource type and to be able to put together a rules, which could be as simple as one line of code. So that's something that we've included in the tool as well, and you would be able to create during the enterprise trial. So our scan is completed. Before I move on, let me pause again to see if there are any questions, anything that we can answer so far. Hopefully everything is pretty straightforward.
Yeah, Ricardo, got a question from Eric. How does Fugue ensure access is limited to only Fugue using the IAM role?
Very good question. So one of the things that we do, and I could actually go and let me see if the stack is already created. I can show you the role that we've created. There are a number of things that we do. So there's a cross-account role that's within that stack. The other thing is there's an SCS external ID. That particular ID, and actually I'll just go into I'll look for this role in IAM. I love the question, and I'll actually just kind of go to it live here. So there's an external ID that we use that is unique to every customer. So when you create that Fugue tenant, we establish a trust relationship. So this particular string value here, which is roughly about 60+ characters, is auto-generated and can only be used within your account. So that's, you'll have that as well as the trusted, the cross-account role with Fugue's account. So without these two things being consistent on both sides, there's no other way that you could access that account. So it's something that we look for. It's an AWS best practice from a security standpoint. So that's what we're doing. Hopefully that answers the question. If not, certainly post again and I'd be happy to answer it. Are we good, Drew?
We are. Prabhakar has a question. Let's see if I can unmute.
Yeah, hi. So the trust relationship in IAM role is with the Fugue AWS account, right?
Yes.
Okay, so Fugue has one AWS account, and from that account we are allowing the role to be executed using a
Correct.
string value.
Correct.
So that is unique. Okay. Yeah. So in future, do you have any idea to set up an account in our organization itself? For example, we are multi account cloud platform, AWS multi account. So is there any way that it is possible to set up in our organization account itself?
Sure. So I think that really, like, if you're using AWS organizations, to be able to set it up at a master account level and then have it be able to use that master account ARN to create environments in other accounts. Is that?
Yeah.
That what? So today, so it's absolutely something that we're looking to incorporate. It's probably a better question for somebody on our security team. So I would certainly follow up with you as to why we haven't done it that way today. We do have customers that, because you can create these environments in an automated fashion, they will just have an array of account numbers and will just crawl through and create everything that way. But it's certainly something, doing it from a master account ARN. There is a reason why we have not done that. And I think it has to do with security, and I'd certainly love to follow up with you and have that conversation.
Okay.
So by now, I'm hoping that everybody is at this page with their cloud environments. I'm sure many of you have jumped ahead, and that's always great. But the first thing we're going to do is just look at what we have here. So we have this created environment. We see our account ID in the region. You'll also notice that this scan interval is really set on a 24-hour interval. So this is one of those use cases where we would look at something on a daily basis to really check our compliance posture. You'll also see here we have not established a baseline and we're not doing any enforcement. Our two compliance families are the two that we set up when we did our initial launch, is just CIS and the Fugue best practices. So the first thing we're actually going to do is just look at things in the visualizer. So how has Fugue mapped out what I have deployed in this particular environment? And here we are able to see everything that we have. So one of the things that you'll notice is right now we have these red areas. These red areas basically correspond to compliance violations. So we do have the ability to exit out of the or remove that particular overlay. So just by opening this little button, settings button on the lower left-hand side, we can get rid of that overlay and just kind of look at things this way. What you'll see is these blue marks here are kind of an animation that expands and retracts when we have multiples of any sort of resource type. So in this case, we have multiple DynamoDB tables, and we can expand that out. We also have multiple S3 buckets, and we can expand that out. The other thing that you will see here is we have kind of a visual effect of the more you zoom in, the more information that you're able to glean out of these visualizations. So we now can see the subnets that we have deployed, as well as the different security groups. So we can highlight and hover over individual security groups to get detail of what resources are in a specific security group. We also have the names associated with all of our resources. So whether Fugue demo is a name, any other name that you may have, you would see that in your visualization. When we add the overlay, we now see where we are in violation. So any specific resource that is in violation of one of the compliance families that we've selected is where we would see this sort of red hazard mark. And we can click into that, and now we understand specifically which rule we failed and why. So in this case, we're looking at CIS 2-9, which is specific to VPC flow logging. It should be enabled. And there are also details in our documentation as to how you would fix that. So how you would go about adding a flow log to a VPC, you'd be able to see that. Within our S3 buckets, we can expand as well, and we can see the different rules that we have failed here. And in this case, we're looking at a Fugue best practice. So the S3 buckets should have all block public access option enabled, something that we encourage customers to do. And you may have situations where you want a bucket to remain public, but certainly we want to alert you of that violation and that risk so that you're aware of it. Another nice feature of Fugue is all of the visualizations that are going to be captured, and they're captured at this point on a daily basis. If we change our scan interval, obviously they would be captured on a more frequent basis, but we can go back in time using this button here to be able to see whenever those visualizations were created, and every subsequent scan you will see listed here, where we'll have a number of different scans that will be available to us to review. Outside of visualization, we always encourage customers to actually set up to receive an overview or a summary of what they have scanned and get an overview compliance summary. And that is done in the settings. So if you click on the settings button, here you're able to update the different resource types that you are interested in scanning. So you may want to change that. We'll also talk about, if we have a couple of minutes after, creating an environment where we may look at some highly critical resources. So maybe we carve out just our VPCs and security groups and S3 buckets, where we can create additional environments that way. You can also modify the compliance families that you are choosing to scan against. You'll be able to update enforcement settings. So if we are doing a baseline and baseline enforcement, which again, you would have to modify your role ARN to do, you would be able to do that there. And here is where we want to set up and perhaps maybe send this email to our analyst friend that we gave read-only access to send a compliance report email. So they would get a high-level summary either every day or every week that would give them information on the Fugue environment that we've created, and they would be able to see on a daily or weekly basis how the environment is from a compliance perspective. The last thing I want to go over is to talk about things from a compliance standpoint. So when you look at this compliance view, this is essentially going to give you the rundown of everything from a text perspective. So what you'll see here is all of the rules that we are checking for. Any area where you see a fail, you'll be able to click into it specifically to get details. So as we talked about, or as we saw in the visualization, and we'll go right to it, a CIS 2-9 failure for our VPCs. If we click on that, we see specifically the resource IDs that are affected. All of these VPCs in this account don't have flow logging turned on. So we've got a fail for all of these, but this will allow us to go directly into the AWS console, plug in this VPC, go directly to it, and make those modifications to bring it into compliance. We also have the ability to filter the data by resource type. So if there are specific resource types that we're interested in, we can filter it by the compliance family. And then again, look at the different resource types. So we can look at our instances, our security groups, VPCs, and maybe our S3 buckets to get specific information that will give us details on compliance or non-compliant. Looks like our other resources are compliant. It's just the VPCs. And again, we have our CIS 2-9 failure there. The last view that we have is a compliance by resource view. Now this view will give a specific resource ID. So if we wanted to look at our environment from a resource ID perspective, we can do that here. Another nice thing about this particular view is you could also view things by tag. So if you have a complex tagging schema, Fugue is capturing that information. So we can filter out by different tags, and then we can look at a specific compliant environment or an application environment by way of the tags to be able to look at those things and see whether we are in compliance or out of compliance from that perspective as well. So a number of different ways to filter that out. Another thing that I will point out is all of this information, as well as the ability to filter it, is all accessible via the API, which is, again, something that you have complete access to during your enterprise trial. So I'm going to stop there. I'm going to change screens and actually show you a little bit about drift detection and establishing baselines. And actually, I can establish a baseline in this account. And let me explain it first before I do that. So what we're doing when we establish a baseline, we want you to understand that a baseline is independent of the compliance posture. So when Fugue establishes a baseline, when you click this button, it essentially does not matter how compliant or non-compliant your environment is. What you are doing at that point is you're telling Fugue, this is my known good configuration, or this is the configuration that I want set, and any deviation from that configuration, I want to be notified. That is done simply by clicking the Establish Baseline button, which I've done here. Fugue then gives me a successfully established baseline notification. And at this point, I now know that if there's any deviation from this baseline, any changes, they will appear in my Events tab. So I can also look at the baseline that I've clicked. I see the date and time that that baseline was established. And I have resource IDs for everything that is compiled in that baseline. So since we're scanning everything, keep in mind, we're capturing details on all of the IAM resources, any sort of CloudWatch or log resources, metric filters, those sorts of things, CloudWatch log groups, all of those things are going to be contained in that baseline. And that's something that Fugue is capturing for you. So any deviation in the configuration of those things is cause for alert. So upon the next scan, any deviation, you will get alerts for that. Again, this is something that can be triggered via an API call. So when we talk about automation, if you are automating using infrastructure as code, you can add an additional script that could turn on the baseline, could trigger a scan, can turn off the baseline. Pretty much everything that you can do within this UI, you are able to do via the API as well. So our goal is really to make this a friendly experience, put these sorts of controls in the hands of developers, and to make sure that the developers, engineers, operations team get that sort of actionable information upon deployment that they could take action. So before things move into a prod stage, you make sure that you have brought things into compliance and into the security and into the level of security that you want for that specific application or that environment. I know we're running short on time, so I just want to jump into showing you the Fugue plans, which you will see. So everyone, once you've signed up, you have complete access. So you have an enterprise trial. So with the enterprise trial, what that gives you is everything that I've shown you. So the ability to establish baselines, the ability to turn on drift detection, to create multiple Fugue environments. So based on different use cases, you can establish multiple environments. You can add any number of groups and users to your account. Obviously, you'll have the visualizer view. You'll have all of the compliance families that are out of the box, again, mapped to the specific controls as they relate to public cloud infrastructure. Drift detection, auto remediation, custom rules, essentially everything on the enterprise level. During the trial, you will not have the single sign-on integration, but that is available to you. After the 30-day trial, it shifts to the developer plan. So the really nice thing about the developer plan is it's free. So it's something that you can use up to 5 users. You do have a restriction of the number of resources. So if you're working in a shared environment or a very small team, that's always great that you'd be able to do scans on demand. You have full access to the API. We also have a CLI within our GitHub repo, and I'll actually show that as well, where you could access that.
Great, because we had a question about the CLI, so definitely get there.
Perfect. Yeah, so drift detection, auto remediation, custom rules. So pretty much everything, all the features that you would want to have as an individual, you have full access to with the developer edition. So we really encourage folks to sign up to get your hands dirty with Fugue, test things out, auto remediation, building other environments. We certainly encourage you to do that. If there are any other questions, I will open it up now. If you want to raise hands, I'm actually going to type away and jump into our GitHub repo, and I will post that URL in the chat as well.
Looks like, yep, go ahead, Prabhakar.
Yeah, it's a follow-up question from the previous one. I don't know if you have already mentioned it. I would like to know this service is a SaaS. It can be available only as software as a service, or we can set up in our own on-prem cloud itself. I mean, I want to know whether it can be available only.
Yeah, great question. So today it is a 100% SaaS deployment. So if there are instances that, if you're looking to have your own private instance of Fugue, for example, it's not something that we're entertaining. It's definitely a discussion point, which I would refer you to somebody probably in our sales organization to have that discussion. But today it is 100% SaaS.
Okay. Listen, then this is my last question. So we have our own governance script, complaints, strategies, our own levels of naming convention, everything. We have our own governance script. So is it possible to put that governance complaints levels also in Fugue?
Yeah, so that's a great question. It is absolutely possible. So yeah, so one of the things you'll see here is what we've created. This is in a public repo. This is kind of examples of custom rules that we've written. But if you think about it, I would say it's, a lot of the security rules that customers have, say in their, in your corporate environments or as an enterprise, aren't covered in some of the compliance families. So you might have a separate list of rules that you want to check against. And that's why we've added this feature. So being able to write these sorts of rules, and if you look at them, they're not terribly complex. So this is a rule that has to do with no ingress port 9200. This is the full code written in Rego that you could incorporate into your Fugue dashboard. So you would just be able to cut and paste this sort of information here, and that's a rule that could check. So yes, you could have a number of rules that you want to incorporate and check on your environment. You could do that and just have a custom rules check, or you could incorporate that and have those checks along with a compliance family check. So absolutely 100% what you're seeking to do, we can do that. Any other questions?
We do have one about whether Fugue requires agents in my environment.
Another great question. So I think one of the things that we talk about, and I think that we live by, we really want to make the experience working with Fugue and getting set up with Fugue really quickly. So what I did just now was the complete setup. So there are no agents to install. There's no additional infrastructure that you have to run in your own environments. So it's 100% SaaS. Obviously, we're taking the additional security measures with the cross-account role and the SCS external ID. For each tenant, each individual tenant will have their own unique ID and role arm that will permit Fugue's account to access. But it is 100% SaaS, so no agents to install, no additional infrastructure. You don't have to, add a separate logging server in your environment. None of that. So the setup that we just did was absolutely all you need to get started with Fugue. Any other questions?
We are clear of questions at the moment.
So the only thing that I would I will leave with are these kind of buttons at the bottom. Hopefully everybody is seeing my screen here. So as you interact with Fugue, we certainly want to hear from you. So if there are certain features that you have questions about, you can interact with us through the support channel. You could also look at our docs. I encourage everyone to go through our docs, talk about a couple of different use cases, suggest a feature, those sorts of things. And actually, before we go, I'll show you really quickly how quickly you can establish a different use case. So if we wanted to look at, say, an isolated group of infrastructure within your environment, just to show you how simple it is. So if I'm going to grab this role arm really quickly, because this is giving me the permissions that I need to scan everything. But if we define a new environment, webinar test 2, all we can simply do is if we decide that we don't want to scan everything, and this kind of relates to also to the question that was asked, we can look at that same group of infrastructure. We can identify, and I'll just do my S3 buckets. I can identify a group and just look at everything in the S3 family. So we're looking at my bucket metric, notification policies, whether it's public or non-public. And I can create a rule there. Just look at Fugue best practices, for example, and even directly to the gentleman that asked about the custom rules. Once you establish a custom rule, your custom rules will appear at the bottom here. So you could just decide that you only want to view things in your environment from a custom rules perspective. So you could create an environment that looks at CIS and then create a separate environment if you didn't want to look at them together that's looking at your custom rules. But as simple as that is I can create another environment. So this environment that's being created now is strictly looking at my S3 bucket. So that's building. So, we really want to make this a sort of experience that's for multiple use cases and obviously that you have the control and that's going to give you the information regarding the resources and the environments within your organization. So I'll leave you with that. That will take a couple of minutes to set up. But if there are no other questions, we absolutely appreciate your attention today.
Yep, there's one quick question.
Okay.
Will I see API calls that Fugue makes in CloudTrail for my account?
Simple answer, yes.
Great.
So if that's it, I will. I thank everyone for their time today. I believe we did record this. So if you wanted to refer back to it, you certainly can. But we always encourage customers to reach out to us, communicate with us through support or otherwise, and hope everyone enjoys using Fugue. So thank you for your time.
Yep. Thanks, everybody. We would love to hear your feedback. So please do let us know if there's, your impressions of Fugue, if there's anything that we can do to improve your experience or the value you get from Fugue. And would just remind you, it takes about 10 minutes to go from 0 to everything you just saw with from Ricardo, getting your full visualization, validation against a number of compliance policies, and really just move forward on being able to move fast while maintaining the security posture of your cloud infrastructure. So thanks everybody again for giving us a look, and happy fuging.